This week is session 3, Renaissance, and it's famously called the 12th century Renaissance. And we're going to cover topics of universities, the revival in classical literature and Gothic architecture. And we'll be doing more art and philosophy and that sort of thing in the next session, but it'll take another direction entirely after that. Anyhow, to get into the heart of it. So we talked in the first session about the significant increase in urbanization. And what that brought with it was a significant increase in the use of and the study of law, because a totally new social environment required a legal infrastructure to sort itself out. And by that, I mean not only the building of cities, but the building of the bureaucracies for the new nation states. And in the 11th century, what was resurrected was the compendium of Roman law that's known as the digests or the pandects that were written or developed under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD, when he was the emperor of the entire Roman Empire, but based in Constantinople. And this book, this collection, this digest, was rediscovered by the West. It had copies of it had been around, but it was resurrected by a number of eminent intellectuals. First amongst them was the great scholar Gratian, who publishes the first great legal textbook that's going to be used as a textbook at universities, the Decretum, or the Decretals of Gratian. And it was immensely useful, particularly to the new political entities, because being an imperial document, Roman law had a bias in favor of the powers that be, absolutism, or the prince, if you will, or the mayor, if you will, of whatever civic entity we should be applying the laws to. And the papacy received it well because, of course, they saw themselves in the same imperial structures as the emerging kings and princes of ever larger territories that were developing in the West in the 10th and 11th and now into the 12th century. So the nascent monarchies and the new urban communes all had a stake in this kind of law. Everywhere in Europe, in continental Europe, this is the legal system that carries forth into the Renaissance and into the early modern and modern periods. It is Roman law. The only place in Europe that doesn't use Roman law is Britain, mainly because before the advent of the legal training systems that were developed on the continent, England had, in the Norman conquest, established German law and began to build an infrastructure, otherwise what we would call common law, which, by the way, is not biased towards the prince. It's trial by jury. It's a very different organizational principle from precedent, not from right. And in England, the feudal system began to evolve into a state system before Roman law had roots on the continent, or the kinds of roots that France and places in Italy and Spain would take advantage of. So law was socially useful as a study, as a discipline. The swiftly transforming political and social landscape required legal infrastructure. You needed rules. There were these new social classes that had developed that were outside the framework of existing feudal society. You had entrepreneurs. You had the new proletarian classes. You had the new craft classes in the communal entities of northern Italy and northwestern France. Bureaucracies were emerging in the expanding national and civic institutions, and trained people were needed to staff them. So we segue from the need for law and the resurrection of Roman law very naturally into the development of universities, mainly because 80% of anyone who studied at a university in the 12th to 13th centuries was a law student. This was the new hot career. To make it onto the staff of a local prince, to make it into the bureaucratic infrastructure of one of the communes, to be a hanger-on in one of the new courts, whether the court was in Salamanca and Spain, or whether the court was in London, or whether the court was in Cologne or Paris or Pisa or Padova. If you look at that chart in the upper right, there are three lines. The x-axis from left to right are the centuries, 800, 1000, 1200, 1400 to 1600. And the left or y-axis on the left side is the numbers of urbanizational growth and manuscript per urban growth. The numbers of manuscripts that we can count in libraries by period. And of course, the growth of universities is the y-axis on the right side. But you'll see, as urbanization develops, manuscripts develop, and universities develop. It all happens together. And remember, the educational institutions of the earlier Middle Ages were monasteries. They were essentially rural. They were biased to theological study, and they were biased to the clergy. Now you're getting institutions that, in distinction, are urban, not clerical, and not theological in mission. Total transition. So the earliest universities, or faculties, as they were sometimes called, were professional schools. They were either law faculties or medical faculties or theology faculties. But by far, as I said, in the 12th century, law was the hottest career. If you look at, and I will show you a map on the next slide, I believe it is, that show more universities. But look at, these are major early ones, and look at the concentration of them in central to northern Italy. You also find them at some of the great Christian courts in Spain, because they're Christian by this point in time. But they got to build on the Arab infrastructure, the Muslim infrastructure that they displaced. And they begin to develop in some of the central capital cities within the Holy Roman Empire, like Prague and Heidelberg, and also in the Royal French capital of Paris, and the two great ones of Oxford and Cambridge. We'll be talking about those a bit more as we go in England. And you see the years that they develop. You get them, you get like an extremely early one in 1088 in Bologna, which was mainly a medical faculty, but the pace picks up. And if you start looking around the years 1250, 1270, you see that there are many more developed. The universitas, as it's called, developed from urban, cathedral, and monastic schools. They were corporations or guilds They used the civic guild model that other crafts use, but the members of these guilds were either the masters, that is, the teachers, the magistri or magistri in classical Latin, or the students. So sometimes you had universities in which the faculty was organized by the student body, and other times where it was organized by the Guild of Masters. And it was almost always organized around a particular subject area or faculty. The school itself was first called, what evolves into the name university was first called the Studium Generale, a general study, a place that had, and the entry criteria for it, a place that had at least one higher faculty, like medicine or like law, took students from all over the place. You didn't have to be local, and where there was an association of masters, and they get to issue degrees that the masters can carry from one place to another. So the doctor's degree meant a certification by a studium generale that qualified by convention the master to teach at another studium generale. It could travel. The term universitas was first used with a modifier to indicate the corporation of masters, corporation of scholars, or both, as in the Latin phrase, the Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium, which would be the University of Teachers and Students, and shortened to Universitas, simply. And so university took its meaning from the longer phrase. They were autonomous institutions, or tried to be, and the whole principle of academic freedom, which develops in Europe and which is somewhat unique to Europe in this period, is a hallmark of the institution. As their social value became appreciated, universities were granted privileges by the papacy, because sometimes they were organized by fiat, by a papal decree, or by secular powers. A king decides to charter a university, for instance, which freed them from local control. The significance of the charter was that the local bishop or the local commune could not control the curriculum, could not control their influence politically. The whole idea of being chartered by a higher power was to free you not from the power that chartered you, but from local control. And ultimately, it would be from the power that chartered you. Masters from formerly chartered institutions had the privilege to teach at others without being examined or re-examined again. You didn't have to qualify. Once you got qualified, you were in. The study at universities develops the name scholasticism, because it was the if you will, the curriculum of those who taught in universities, the scholars from a university. The development of universities with their use of the dialectical method, which was the common way any subject was taught, whether particularly law and philosophy for that matter. Somebody asserted a proposition, and then people argued for and against the proposition. And then there were arguments for and against the particular arguments that were first made. So if you read Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, the way it's organized is there's a question, a quaestio, and the question then receives one or two or three formal assertions as answers to the question. And then there are formal, if you will, attacks, counter arguments put to those assertions, and then everything gets resolved in a resolving synthetic response to the opposition. So it's question, argument, counter argument, final argument. And these dialectics, people who are good at it, as we will see later on when we start looking at Peter Abellard, who is the most famous of them all in the 12th century for being famous for this, were heralded throughout Europe. Their names rang out, as they say on the wire. They would attract students from all over Europe because there was a common language, which was the language of the university. Clerical Latin was spoken by all the students. So the student quarter around the University of Paris is the Latin quarter, where Latin is the common language because people are showing up, not just from France and Italy and England, but from Germany and Poland and from what will be Prague and Slavic-speaking areas. And within these areas, there were, as you remember, looking at from the first class in this course, the dialects that would have been spoken locally. Arguably, people would show up capable of speaking 3 or 4 or 5 vernaculars, which overlapped with some of the vernaculars that other people were speaking, perhaps. So you needed a lingua latina, you needed a common language, and you needed a Latin quarter where all the fellows could live cheek by jowl with a common culture and study a common curriculum. And since it was pan-cultural, the study of law at a place like Paris or at a place like Bologna, or Montpellier or Salamanca, it could be taken all over continental Europe with the expectation that this is the way law was conceived and would be applied to the new emerging social and political institutions in those places. It meant that Europe was going to develop a common framework. These countries were going to have more in common going forward than they might have had going back in time. So the development of universities with their use of the dialectical method coincided with the translation movement in Spain that introduced philosophical and scientific texts from Arabic sources, which is what we're going to wind up looking at next. So as universities were developed, as dialectics became the major methodology of those universities, texts were arriving that provided classical sources that had been lost to the Latin speaking and reading universe for centuries, ancient texts, translations of all of Aristotle and all of Plato, and medical texts that were developed by the Arabs were going to come to the medical schools and to the law schools. And Aristotelian philosophy and science, which would come to dominate the medieval thought world, were central to that translation movement, and Aristotle in particular, because of his great system of logic, central to the dialectical method. So you wind up with this grand dovetailing of several things that are happening simultaneously. The development of cities and nation states and the need for legal bureaucratic infrastructure, the rediscovery of Roman law, the development of universities to train people in law for those political institutions, the use of dialectical methods by those universities, and the supplying of the textual material that was needed the textbooks that would be needed, the subject matter that would be needed at these universities from the translation movement that was going to be taking place in Spain in the 12th century. Before we leave this slide, if we could take a quick peek at the top, you have probably a medical lecture at the University of Bologna. And doesn't the lecture hall look like a high school class? I mean, it is the model that we have, or a college class, the model that we have of the lectura has been there in place certainly ever since the 11th century. And here we are, a lecture with clerks. These are probably Franciscans studying at the University of Paris, where you had a significant, at Paris, theology faculty. You had Giovanni da Fidanza, otherwise known as St. Bonaventure, the leading Franciscan intellectual at the University of Paris, who was going to be superseded by Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian at the University of Paris, late in the 13th century, which we will talk about next week. Moving along, though, and just to reinforce what I've said over the last couple of slides, there is this dramatic educational shift. So with the development of more concentrated and complex social systems, i.e. cities and nations, monasteries lost their educational and cultural centrality to the universities. Monasteries were rural and contemplative, while universities were urban and socially engaged. And I want to revisit the term contemplative. Monasteries were more contemplative in this period because of the reform movement of the previous century than they had ever been, and would continue to be so. Monasteries were more removed from the development of European culture than they had ever been, and that would be increasingly so. They still would supply popes. They were still the major institution for staffing the church. But as we shall see, an entire, if you will, secular universe of education will arise, and will arise because world trade and business requires it, and the political world requires it. When it fully develops, even though it is a medieval phenomenon, people will begin to call it the Italian Renaissance. It's the Italian Renaissance and is in a very real way a late medieval manifestation of these new secular institutions generating new secular and human values, humanist values that we think of as distinctive, but that were really heavily rooted in the late medieval period. Now, in this map, which is much more detailed than that other little one, you see that there were universities popping up all over the place, and they were not usually associated with church centers, but they were often in major cities, which were also major church cities at the same time. And here is a time chart of major guys. We should bump Oxford up before Paris over here, but Bologna's at the top of the list. And as you start moving down the list, you see that universities were beginning to develop all over Northern Europe as well as the South. Now, since I mentioned that the texts that were going to supply the new student populations at the universities were the product a significant portion of them were the product of the translation movement. First, a little background. When we go to Baghdad and the first translation movement, we can't understand the 12th century translations that were made in Spain unless we have a sense of the translations into Arabic that created the Arab libraries that were going to be translated later on. And in the last course, in the course on the early Middle Ages, we did a whole focus on the first translation movement. And this, so some of you should be fairly familiar with that. This is just a reprise of that, a short adumbration of it. In the 9th century, at Baghdad, under the Abbasid dynasty, which was basically Persian in sentiment and style, translations into Arabic were made at the famous House of Wisdom, as it was called in Baghdad, from Greek, Persian, Syriac, Sanskrit, and even Chinese sources. I'm going to focus on Syriac for a second, if people aren't familiar with the term. It was a family in the same family group as Aramaic. It was a language spoken in Syria that Syrian Christians, Nestorians as they were called, who migrated into the Persian Empire and then became part of the Arab Empire early on. It was their language. And since they were part of the Roman Empire earlier, the Greek Roman Empire, the educated Syriac speakers came with a knowledge of Greek, which would have been the major literary language of their world. So you had these Syriac speakers with a knowledge of Greek in cities in the Muslim world. So the Nestorian, that first bulletin, that the Nestorian Christian communities and the Muslim world supplied scholars who translated the entire Greek heritage, and usually they did it in 2 steps. Greek would go into either Syriac or Persian, the other Demotic language of the Arab world in the East. And then the translation would be made from Syriac or Persian into Arabic. The reason I mentioned the 2-step process is that it means that the translations were probably fairly rife with error and mistranslation and just the kinds of noise that enters into a system when more than 2 languages, 1 to 2, are involved. Once you get 3 or 4 languages involved, there's just more noise in the system. And the reason I mentioned the Nestorian Christian communities and the translations from Greek is because Greek philosophy and science and medicine were immensely influential in the Arab world. And the Arabs built these spectacular collections, these libraries that were filled with every Greek document they could get their hands on, translated into Arabic. And then they proceeded in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries to elaborate on those. So in that next bullet, additionally, Arabic translators and intellectuals wrote extensive commentaries, glosses, comments in the margins. You see these glosses in manuscripts. Commentaries on Greek sources. This is like Talmudic commentary on Torah. And developed a great body of philosophical and scientific thought of their own over the following 2 centuries. So the Arab translators were often much more than translators. They were intellectuals who were saying, here's what Aristotle said. Isn't that interesting? It makes me think X, Y, and Z. And off they would go. And medical science in this period owed tremendous advances to Arabic originality, as did Greek philosophy for that matter. The universities became great homes for this classical revival that was taking place in Spain as part of the second and new translation movement. There was a great body of classical Greek thought that Western Europe had lost for centuries. In the 12th century, with the interest beginning to accelerate at the new educational centers, these universities, they realized that access to Aristotle and the great lost literature was close by. All they had to do, if you see the little circle I drew in the map down below, in Toledo, which, by the way, had very recently moved that line, that red line that is showing the border between Al-Andalus or Muslim-controlled Spain and Castilian-controlled Spain. That line had just moved from above Toledo to below Toledo. And indeed, you now had that one of the major intellectual centers of the emirate, the Arab emirate of Al-Andalus, Andalusia, is now in control of a Christian prince, the King of Castile. It was tantalizingly close. If you were in France, if you were in Italy, you could come down through Catalonia or Aragon or Castile. You could cross the Pyrenees through the passes, and you could come south, and they came in droves to Toledo and then later to Seville, as we will see. Some of the great centers of Al-Andalus were now in Christian hands, thanks to the Reconquista, and were well stocked with libraries and scholars, more importantly than the libraries, scholars who had the right languages. So moving along to the second translation movement. So in Toledo, in the 12th century, a school of translators, which is literally what it was called, the School of Translators, and Toledo, as I mentioned, had been reconquered in 1085, right before this period. Toledo, with its extensive libraries and a vibrant intellectual community, under the sponsorship of a very significant man, Archbishop Raymond, a formal effort was organized to translate Arabic texts into Latin using Mozarabs, who were Christians who'd lived under Muslim rule, who often spoke Andalusi Romance, one of the many Romance dialects that we talked about in the first session, Latin, because it was the ones who were educated, that was the Christian intellectual language, and because they had been living under Arab rule, Arabic. There were Cluniac monks that were sent down. The abbot of Cluny, Peter the Venerable, a famous Benedictine abbot, had actually requested, if you can imagine, an 11th century abbot, early 12th century abbot, requesting a translation of the Quran. Remember, we're into the era of the Crusades. Many of the Crusaders came back with stories saying these people we're fighting are a civilized people. They are people of the book. They are a reverent people. And they have a holy book that might be worth looking at, since Muhammad recognizes Jesus as a fellow prophet. Here you have a Benedictine abbot asking for a translation of the Quran. And the Cluniac monks came down speaking Latin and French and some Andalusi Romance, which whenever I say Andalusi Romance, it's actually a placeholder for any of about 24 dialects, including Castilian, that would have been all over the Spain of this period, and that had not hardened into formal Castilian yet, or what have you. There would have been a huge community of Arabized Jews speaking Arabic, Ladino, Hebrew, and some Romance, Andalusi Romance themselves. Ladino being a, if you will, a Hebrew that has been romanced, that has much the way Yiddish will develop after 1290, when Jews who've been thrown out of France and England, when we get to that point in time, tended to start moving east. So those populations of Ashkenazi that we associate with the German and Polish and Russian worlds may have started off as English and French Jews who migrated, and German Jews who migrated eastward, and Yiddish develops because people who come with Hebrew, wanting to speak the local language, German, developed their own version of Middle German. Ladino was their own version of Jewish Romance, if you will, and then would migrate to Venice later on. The Mudejares, Mudehar is a Muslim and Christian territory. Often the educated ones teach in madrasas. They are Arabic speaking, but they also speak Andalusi Romance. So you will get Jews, monks, Christians who've been Arabized, Muslims who've been Christianized, all living in this melting pot, this intellectual garden of exotic flowers. And they started making translations for the School of Translators, usually again in two steps: Arabic into Andalusi Romance, and Andalusi Romance into Latin. Now, of course, there were translators that went directly from Arabic to Latin, but these would have been like very senior scholars who knew these languages. Much as in the first translation movement, there were people who probably went from Greek right into Arabic. Like Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the sheikh of the translators in Baghdad. He spoke both languages and could read both languages well. But to do an entire school of translation when you have tens of thousands of manuscripts to get translated, here's one book in the picture on this slide, Al-Razi's Book of Medicine, translated by Gerard of Cremona, by the way, who's one of those guys who spoke Arabic too. But it's a sizable book on medicine. And there were tens of thousands of these things. And so you had to hire, if you will, grad students, people who didn't have all the languages, but were sufficiently capable in a number of them to be useful in doing it in two steps. And consequently, whatever liability there was for error in going through the original translation steps, getting Aristotle into Arabic, that's now going to be compounded by getting Aristotle from Arabic into Latin. Now you really are moving around four languages in some cases, to the point that although he started with these translations, by the time we get to the year 1270 at the University of Paris, Thomas Aquinas realizes that it's probably rife with mistakes, because he gets to some tricky parts of the text. And there are people who do know some Greek who are telling him, oh, your Latin translation, is suggesting a spin in that section that I would not take too seriously. And he goes to a fellow Dominican who had been in Constantinople as a translator William of Morbeck, who speaks Greek, and he says to his fellow Dominican, I don't know what a favor this, I can't imagine what a favor this was to call in. How about, why don't you come to Paris and do me a solid and translate all of Aristotle from Greek into Latin, which is a shelf that's about 8 feet wide. And he does, William does. And so Aquinas gets his hands on a better translation. The focus of the translations was on philosophy, medicine, science, and math, from both classical sources and Arabic sources. Philosophical interest centered on Aristotle's corpus, but the commentaries of famous Arab thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna were prized. The contemporary philosophy of the Arab Aristotelian Averroes was also translated. He was alive during and active during this period. So at Toledo, we have several famous people. This is just like this is Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth here. This is the all-star team. There were probably hundreds of people involved in the process. Domingo Gundisalvo, a Spaniard, first director of the School of Translators, otherwise known as Dominicus Gundisalinus in Latin, and he translates Avicenna and Al-Ghazal, and he lives entirely in the 12th century. He has a major number 2 guy who works very closely with him, a Jewish translator, Abraham ibn Dawud, or Ben David, I guess, but Jews often use their Arabic names, so Abraham ibn Dawud, the first Jewish scholar to use Aristotelianism in his philosophical writing. He collaborates with Gundisalvo in translating Avicenna directly from Arabic to Latin. He's a guy who speaks all these languages as well. Then there's Johannes Hispanus, otherwise known as John of Seville, a generation younger, collaborator of Gundisalvo, but he becomes a leading translator into Castilian, because some of the Spanish courts, they're saying, oh, it's great you're translating it to Latin, but guess what? The king doesn't speak Latin all that well. Let's get some of these things into Castilian. He and his family want to be entertained as well. Robert of Kenton came to Al-Andalus to learn Arabic and did direct translations, introduces algebra, al-Jabara, as it would have been known, by translating the work of Al-Khawarizmi, and in the Latin translations, so many paragraphs begin with the phrase dixit algorithmi, which is to say, Al-Khawarizmi says that the word algorithm develops as a mathematical term from Kenton's, Robert of Kenton's translation. The very famous Gerard of Cremona, who's the most prolific translator of scientific and medical texts. And science is going to really dig in places like the University of Paris and Oxford in particular. Most prolific translator of scientific and medical texts, another European who learned Arabic to do direct translations. And then much later, but always has to be mentioned, Michael Scott, a total polymath whose fluency, he probably was fluent in about a half a dozen European vernaculars as well. He is Scottish, but he also is totally fluent in Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew. He translates Averroes and Maimonides at Palermo for the Arabic-speaking Emperor Frederick II. The Norman emperor at Palermo, Frederick II, inherited a court that was so steeped in Arabic law, lore, and intellectual traditions that he learns Arabic. And he wants translations of Averroes and Maimonides into Latin for other people in his polity. And here's a picture of the science translator in the upper right, Gerard of Cremona. And there's Michael Scott. You know, I realized I didn't have my little annotation tool available. Excuse me for 1 second. Let me get my little spotlight. Okay, there we go. So Gerard of Cremona with scientific tools, and here's Michael Scott, the scholar. Alfonso the Wise, King of Castile, now we're into the 13th century. And what I want to point out is that he's called the Wise because he's an intellectual. He maintains this incredibly cosmopolitan court, famous for its intellectual standards and devotion to translation. So translation continues even after the Toledo School of Translators. His great contribution was to abandon Latin and sponsor translations into the Castilian vernacular. And this is why, by the way, Castilian becomes Spanish. Just the way Dante is the reason why Tuscan becomes Italian. You get the first great literature in that particular dialect, and then it becomes the dominant dialect. By promoting it as a language of culture, science, and law, modern Spanish would emerge. Jewish scholars, because of their intellectual sophistication and command of both Arabic and Castilian, many of Alfonso's translators were Jews. And he had translations made of Talmud and the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah, by the way, the mystical Jewish tradition, was really developed in Provence in the early part of the 13th century. And you have Alfonso aware of this because it was in Hebrew, and he wants translations made so he can read it. Everybody was interested in mystical literature in this period. And since Jews were such eminently scholarly and professional people in the court, he thought there must be something in Talmud. Let's have a translation of that. So by the end of the 13th century, the cultural cosmopolitanism of both the Emirate of Cordoba and the Kingdom of Castile would wither under the glare of militancy and puritanism on both sides. It's something that I'm going to be talking about going forward. This vast opening of the European mind and the continued openness of Muslim secular culture on both sides. On the Muslim side, brands of fundamentalism, which will dominate in Cordoba and in other parts of the Muslim world, and which will isolate and freeze in place Arab intellectual traditions from this period. All that science, all that philosophy, all that innovation had been the product of a secular strain in Islamic culture that will get overwhelmed by the religious strain and the fundamentalist strain. In the Christian world, the assertion of, if you will, intellectual supremacy, the flexing of biceps by the papacy and the church, and what it will do in the suppression of heresies, which is, that's in not next week, but the lecture after that, will really close down the church's receptivity to certain strains of intellectual thought in the West. They will stay around. A secular tradition will maintain itself at the universities, and religious traditions that are heterodox, heretical, not orthodox, will stay around. So the church will not be able to enforce a suppression of intellectual renaissance, and indeed, the Italian Renaissance proves that point, but it will mean that the Christian receptivity to intellectual thought from other traditions, like the Jewish and the Arabic traditions, will become very circumscribed. You will get a hardening of the borders, if you will. You will get less receptivity to the other side. So Renaissance, the growth of sophisticated professional classes and the development of universities fanned an interest in law, art, science, philosophy. The translation movement fed that flame. It was the chance to recapture long-lost classics of the Western tradition and to tap into the phenomenal scientific and philosophical contributions of the Muslim and Jewish worlds. And here you have the court of Alfonso X of Castile, and you have him surrounded by literary types and intellectuals. Now, what is known as the 12th century Renaissance formally often includes stuff that was happening at the universities and the new brands of philosophy that were being taught. I can't do justice to all of it, but I can focus on two very significant figures, one of which Pierre Abellard, the greatest philosopher of the 12th century, the greatest European philosopher of the 12th century. He is a logician, a theologian, a poet, a musician, a master teacher, a groundbreaking autobiographer, and an egotist without equal, as we'll see in some of the statements. Thousands of students flocked to Paris. He's teaching at the old cathedral school of Notre Dame that becomes the University of Paris to hear him. And his love affair with the brilliant, who's the other person I want to talk about, the brilliant Heloise, has been a subject of the Romantic imagination for centuries. Abellard and Heloise, we have operas and novels and stories and songs and a million works of depiction of artistic representation. Much of 12th and then into the 13th century, philosophy hung on the so-called problem of universals. This is a problem in trying to answer questions in what philosophy calls metaphysics, or the nature of the world. And it is even more fundamentally an issue in epistemology, philosophy of knowledge. And the issue is basically, well, let me read into it as we're going here. The translation of Aristotle into Latin framed for the modern world the central questions of epistemology, language, and metaphysics. What do we know? How does language work? What is real? And at the root of all those questions is the question of universals. Now, there are, if you will, three very, in general, I'm oversimplifying here, but in general, there are three basic approaches to this question. The first one proposed in the 5th century BC and mainly in the 4th century BC, but starting in the 5th century BC, by Plato, is called usually Platonic realism. The dominant philosophical tradition of the early Middle Ages was based on Plato. It was Platonist or Neoplatonist via St. Augustine, who based a lot of his thought on Plato. And Plato maintained that general ideas, and here's the problem, the modern world sees as a linguistic problem, but it's a philosophical problem of the highest order. It's the first question. General ideas, for example, tree, and by which I mean a general idea is a concept that applies to multiple particular things. Res, the Latin word for thing. General idea, for example, tree, or table, or equality, or two, the number two. According to Plato, these were real things that existed outside our minds. There really was two really existed outside of our conception. And indeed, our conception is an imperfect attempt at seeing what two really is, two-ness, equality in its purest, tree in its purest meaning, etc. So for Plato, these were things. So one possibility in answering the question of universals as the philosophers at the universities began to argue this was Plato's thesis of realism. Early in the 12th century, Rochelin, and he may not have been the first, but Rochelin of Compiègne, otherwise known as Rochelinus in Latin, became the leading theorist of an anti-realist position that regarded universals as voces, voices, meaning that universals are not res, they don't really exist as things outside the mind. They're merely words. And for Rochelinus, a word is the sound your mouth makes. That's it. And the theory called nominalism, this would be the most extreme, unsophisticated version of nominalism, belonged to Rochelinus. Abellard comes along and wants to refine Rochelinus's conception, and he wants to argue against Platonic realism. In fact, in a very famous statement of his that in Latin goes, rem de re predicare monstrum, which means it is monstrous to predicate a thing of a thing. So if you say Fido is a dog, where Fido is the name of a particular dog, and dog is the universal word dog, and he says, well, it's a monstrosity to say that this thing is that thing. Two things can't be the same thing. And he says, that's crazy. It's crazy talk. So he tries to refine nominalism into something that a modern might call conceptualism, universals, and Aristotle was fairly closer to this version of things. Universals are conceptualized frameworks within the mind. They do not exist in particular things beyond the mind's perception of them. So tree is something that exists in the mind. They do, however, have informational content. That is, they signify, they have meaning. A concept, for example, rabbit, does not refer to an arbitrary collection of particulars. So you couldn't pick up a glass of pencil sharpener and a rabbit and call them all rabbit. That there's something in the word rabbit that signifies the concept corresponds to a real definition that in some sense latches onto the nature of the thing, but that exists only in the mind. So unpacking this has great implications. How does language work? What's really real? Uh, how does the mind work? Is the mind ever fooled? Does what the mind have as a picture of something, is it the same that a different mind has as the picture of something? When I say tree, is that the same tree you have in mind? How do we communicate? All of what comes to be modern philosophy spills out of this attempt to figure out how language and universals in language work. And this becomes one of the great launching points for medieval philosophy. Everybody weighs in on this. Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, Duns Scotus, the great Scottish philosopher. Everybody winds up having to figure out how the mind works and whether we can trust what we think we know. Because one of the great medieval questions, I know what I believe on faith. I know what I think is reasonable to assume. Faith and reason is the two great pillars of intellectual knowledge, as they would have thought in the medieval period. But are the products of reason, are they valid? Can I trust them? Are they reliable? How well do I know? Do you remember in the biopic on the life of Lenny Bruce, Dustin Hoffman plays Lenny Bruce, and his wife comes home and finds him in bed with another woman. And he says, only modern politicians could say this as well. He says, are you going to believe me, or are you going to believe your lying eyes? Well, here are the central philosophical questions. What is to be trusted, and how does reason work? Dialectics, the core method of study in the universities, enhanced by the aggressive promotion of the Aristotelian methodology, was dialectical argument, and Abellard was a master at this and a merciless dialectician. People hated to debate him because he would crucify them. And of course, this would all be taking place in public. Somebody would state a thesis, a great debate. The two arguers would get up in front of the audience of students who would fill the stands at the local gymnasium, and the debate would ensue as if it were a rugby game with people cheering for each side. By applying rigorous analysis to dogmatic positions, he ran afoul of Orthodox churchmen, particularly the famous Bernard of Clairvaux. Remember the great Cistercian saint and Puritan who argued for the Second Crusade, who argued that the truths of faith were plain and simple. A lot of theologians of the stamp of Bernard wanted to argue, not to confuse the common people, hey, Christ has spoken, here's the text, it's plain, it's simple to understand, let's not mess with that, with all the sophisticated knowledge, with all the sophisticated intellectual technique that you are bringing to bear on what should be a fundamentally simple issue, which is why modern fundamentalists are very distrustful of university education, for instance. And his famous book, Sic et non, which means thus and not, Abellard took authoritative statements from church fathers on opposite sides of key questions. So he would quote from fathers of the church that argued one side and then argued the other side of the same question to make the point that with that dialectical examination, nothing was simple or self-evident. St. Augustine wrote two books on, in the one in the late 4th century and one in the early 5th century, on freedom of the will and whether or not God's grace allowed for humans to freely choose and self-determine their destiny, or whether it was the grace of God that controlled that destiny, sort of a Catholic versus a Protestant or Lutheran position on the issue. And each of those two books, the first one took sort of the Catholic position, and the second one took sort of the Protestant tradition. So Abellard could have used Augustine on both sides of the question and said, maybe we do need dialectical examination to clarify this. So, and the great debates of faith versus reason, Abelard's defense of rationalism led to accusations of heresy. He probably was not a heretic, but he was subject to the accusations right and left. Héloïse d'Argenteuil, who's born much after him, we're not sure about her birth year, but she's maybe somewhere between 10 and 20 years younger than him. She's a student of his. She's a philosopher. She's a scholar. She becomes an abbess. She is the great, maybe first, if not first, very early medieval woman who you would call a self-conscious feminist. She's the quintessential woman of letters. She's renowned in Paris in her time for penetrating intelligence and command of classical languages. She knew Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. She enters Abelard's life at the height of his fame. And remember, he was a god. He was a movie star. He was rock and roll. He was what was happening in 12th century Paris at the university. And here comes this brilliant, attractive young woman into his sphere of influence. And they begin first an intellectual, and then it spills into a romantic relationship that serves as the template later on, by the way, when we get to discussions of courtly poetry, this becomes the model, one of the great topics of courtly love and the romantic movement that ensues later on in the century. Her correspondence with Abellard, her letters back and forth with Abellard, become an archetype in French tradition of letters, the epistolary literature in French. And I quote one of her letters at the bottom: "If there is anything which may properly be called happiness here below, I am persuaded it is the union of two persons who love each other with perfect liberty, who are united by a secret inclination." Liberty, that's interesting. We're both free. We're united by a secret inclination and satisfied with each other's merit. Their hearts are full and leave no vacancy for any other passion. They enjoy perpetual tranquility because they enjoy content. If I could believe you as truly persuaded of my merit as I am of yours, I might say, there has been a time when we were such a pair, alas. And here's a picture from some manuscript of them early on. He writes a autobiography, the Historia Calamitatum, the story of my calamities. And it is an apologetic. Boy, have I had things bad. And it is a peek into the personal, unlike anything that has ever been written in the West before this time. I mean, it is an autobiography that has this subjective bent to it that's entirely modern in its tone. So to appease, Héloïse has an uncle Fulbert, a nobleman. Abellard and Fulbert have agreed to a secret marriage because they're afraid that his being married when clerics had the leading teaching positions at the university would damage his career. And indeed, Héloïse says that the marriage should stay secret for the sake of Abelard's career. So she's still living with her uncle, but she's married. And she gives birth to a boy, which Good students of science that she and her lover Pierre happened to be. They name Astrolabe for the navigational instrument that had recently been invented. Um, this sounds like it sounds like the 1960s all over again, doesn't it? Astrolabe, I love it. When Fulbert violated the agreement that they had by broadcasting the fact of the marriage, Heloise objected, and the relationship became potentially, we don't know a lot of details about it, but it may have even gotten abusive. We know she got very ticked off, and Abelard's worried for her. He smuggles her out and sends her to the convent at Argenteuil, infuriated that he's lost control of his niece. Fulbert arranges a break into Abelard's lodging and has him castrated. Abellard, there's much back and forth. This is a real abridgment of the story. Abellard winds up becoming a monk at Saint Denis, the famous Benedictine Abbey of Saint Denis, which we will talk about in a bit. And Heloise takes the veil and eventually becomes an abbess. And Abellard tries in some of the letters to say, I never really loved you. We don't know whether he's sincere about that or is just trying to make the best of a bad circumstance. And Heloise responds, the unhappy consequence of our love and your disgrace have made me put on the habit of chastity, but I am not penitent of the past. I am not penitent of the past. Thus I strive and labor in vain. Among those who are wedded to God, I am wedded to a man. Among the heroic supporters of the cross, I am the slave of a human desire. At the head of a religious community, I am devoted to Abellard alone. This relationship, such a romantic trope. I could have chosen any of about 10,000 paintings and manuscript etchings of the pair, either and the bottom here we see a late Victorian idolization of the young girl with Abellard looking over the shoulder. Earlier romantic period, there's Uncle Fulbert in the background depiction, right down to Diana Rigg in the film version, 1971. It never dies. The story never dies. Speaking of Bernard, though, we have abbot, doctor of the church, mystic, counselor to kings and popes, preacher of the Second Crusade, enemy of philosophical rationalism, and denouncer of Peter Abellard. He defines the essence of the Cistercian reform movement, and he becomes important for two things. The cult of Mary, Bernard's devotion to the Blessed Virgin, is distinctively Cistercian. Trappists, who are a version of Cistercians, Trappist monks, all have the first name Mary. So if somebody's named Lewis, his name is really Mary Lewis. You'll see Trappists always sign their names M, and then M. Lewis, M. Albert, M. Harold, M. whatever. And in a famous mystical depiction, and there's several paintings, Renaissance and medieval paintings of this. This is called the Lactation of Saint Bernard. This one is from 1650. Monstra te esse matrum, show me that you are a mother. And Mary squeezes nourishing milk from her breasts into the mouth of Bernard. We have many pictures of the famous lactation of Bernard, which is sort of an odd, something you wouldn't see in a Protestant church, I imagine. Anyhow, the other focus, though, we have for Bernard, which I cannot stress enough, is because it has in it the whole tradition of personal piety as it had begun in the century before and is going to continue through extreme expressions of piety and mysticism like that of Francis of Assisi. You have Bernard's idea of infused contemplation. He introduces the idea that through intensely focused meditation, an intuitive passive state can be reached that invites a direct, extra-rational, beatific connection with God. You often find this in Trappist documents, Cistercian writing, that they talk about disciplined meditation. John of the Cross will talk about the great Carmelite, and Teresa of Avila, the great Carmelite mystics, will talk about going through a dark night of the soul in which you meditate on Christ's sacrifice for you, your unworthiness, your futility, until you empty yourself of all pride, of all self-regard, and ultimately, it's very Buddhist, if you will, you empty yourself of ego. You become nothing. And then into that passive nothing state, the grace of God, it's a surrender to grace. The grace of God comes to you in direct apprehension that's not intermediated by reason, a direct, extra-rational, beatific connection. Christ fills you. You receive the embrace of Christ directly and without mediation. The surrender to grace is at the heart of Bernard's critique of rationalist philosophy and the new dialectical approach of the schools. Now, somebody like Thomas Aquinas, who says the existence of God can be proven by reason, he is also a mystic, though, who at the end of the Summa Theologica says, well, this is my baby book. This is where reason stops. This is when you come up against the limit. Yeah, you can prove that a God does exist, he would argue, but this isn't how you come to God. That is something that must be mystically embraced. And here you have the passive Bernard, and we talked about personal religion, and Christ is now the human and the sacrifice Christ. Here you have Christ looking like the body, the corpus of a crucifix, coming down from the cross to embrace Bernard in a mystical union. So Bernard is the major link between the new piety and all later expressions of purity, including attacks on the later church. So on the one hand, he's a link to the Orthodox reformers and mystics, Francis of Assisi, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen, Teresa of Avila. And on the other hand, he's a link to heretical reformers and mystics, Joachim of Flora, John Wycliffe, Jan Hus. And here in that picture, you have the very depiction of the new piety, Bernard embracing the human, crucified, suffering Christ. And in our last peek at the Renaissance of this period, this great emergence of genius, is Abbot Suger and the rise of Gothic architecture. Abbot Suger, who is the abbot of Saint-Denis in Paris, which is the first great Gothic structure in the world. And while Suger may not have invented it, and he's not the architect of it, and indeed the master architect is unknown, he is the sponsor of it and the spokesperson for it. and the man who sees it through all of its funding. And if you will, he is the great monastic patron of the Gothic invention. His interest in mystical theology, the so-called Pseudo-Dionysius, a book from the 6th century that was associated with a follower of St. Paul's. They thought it was written earlier. But since it's Neoplatonic, its focus is on grace and inspiration, not on reason and the world of the senses. And it's thought to have contributed to his promotion of this new style, on which he wrote several books. And we have a couple of pictures of Saint-Denis. The one in the middle here shows two towers. One tower actually fell in the 19th century. So this is an artist's depiction based on an 18th century drawing of it when it still had the lower spire. Gothic verticality, more than anything else, verticality, that the north-south line, the high-low line, the taking of the mind and of the soul from the mundane, earthbound thought up towards heaven, as a suggestion of the spiritual. Here is, in Saint-Denis, in one of the stained glass windows, here is a depiction of Sujet. And a quote of his: "The dull mind rises to truth," rises, goes from the bottom to the top, rises to truth through that which is material. And here, the Gothic materialization is an attempt at bringing the mind to the higher state. What do we have? This is inside Saint-Denis. Again, verticality, arches, vaults, arches to hold up the domes of the verticals as they are constructed. Light, the visualization of the new piety, the images of receiving grace are always images of light. And here we have an architecture that lets in light. And it's because we have windows everywhere. This, and Saint-Denis, as glorious as it is, I can't hold the candle to something like Sainte-Chapelle for the stained glass work itself, but you can see, as even the first of its kind, what a magnificent structure this is. And the windows, the stained glass, the rose windows. Here is perhaps the first rose window in Christendom. Windows everywhere. Windows, arches, and towering columns. And of course, what do we need to support those columns? The geniuses who developed the architecture, and I don't know how much math they had to determine weight-bearing issues. And indeed, they probably didn't have enough math, because early attempts at building some of these churches ended in collapses. But this church was built by a master. To let in light, they had to cut holes in the walls. Romanesque churches had those gigantic walls. They were castle-like in their construction to hold up whatever verticality they were able to assume. And domes created tremendous strains on the weight-bearing of the walls. And so to keep the walls from pushing away out, they built buttresses to the places between the windows that could lean the walls in and support them. I am sure that I've never read this. I'm sure mathematicians have studied this, or civil engineers have studied this. I'm sure some of these were overbuilt in the beginning. They over buttressed. You would think after a collapse or two, this is what they would turn to. But it's one of the hallmarks of Gothic architecture. And this is the period, the 12th century, when it goes into lift off. And in this century and in the following centuries, all over France, all over England, all over nearby Germany, all over some places in very northern Italy where the Romanesque still held on because it was the old local tradition. But you have this explosion. And you realize what the cost of this building was. And that the sponsorships would either have to be a very rich abbey, which like an urban abbey like Saint-Denis had the wealth, very well endowed abbey, but that these great churches were usually built by cities, by communes, where the rich burghers, rich from trade, had the wealth to spend over 4 generations paying for the bloody thing, since some of these churches took a century to construct. Something we'll talk about more of as we go forward. I've only left 3 minutes here, unfortunately. I'm going to stop the share, and I am going to, if I can, where am I that I can unpin me? Oh, here I am. Remove the pin. And anybody who's got a question or a comment or would like clarification or something.
Lou?
Yes, ma'am.
I noticed that there were women in the 2 paintings of the medical schools.
Yeah, there were women admitted in places. I guess that was Bologna. I think they probably would have been.
Bologna, yeah.
Yeah, they probably would have been nobles or daughters of very significant families to be admitted to that. Much like Heloise herself was able to attend, the University of Paris. I'll try to smuggle in other stuff about and by women as we go along. Anyhow, I know some of you have got to head off to a film class, I think is next. I will send out the slideshow or the PDF from the slideshow on this. And in a day or two, this will, for anybody who wants to see portions of it again, or for the people who couldn't attend this time, there will be the YouTube posting and the whole playlist. They'll be gathered, all the separate videos will be gathered into a playlist of 6. Oh, yeah, John has just said, I've been reading War and Peace, and Peter and Heloise make an appearance there as well. Of course, the 19th century, just the Romantic movement could not get enough Abellard and Heloise. And then, and then you throw in a castration, and the only question is, how did Ernest Hemingway not have a go at this one? That's the only thing you're left questioning. Anyhow, gang, I'll see you next week. It's 3:00 for the people who got to leave.